In the sprawling industrial heartland of Brazil, where massive petrochemical complexes stretch toward the horizon like concrete monuments to economic ambition, one company stood above all others as the undisputed king of Latin America's chemical empire. BRASKEM, the region's largest petrochemical producer, commanded revenues exceeding $15 billion annually and employed over 8,000 workers across dozens of facilities. Founded in 2002 through the merger of 6 smaller petrochemical companies, BRASKEM had quickly established itself as a global powerhouse, producing millions of tons of polyethylene, polypropylene, and other essential plastics that found their way into everything from automotive parts to food packaging across the Americas. The company's success story seemed to embody Brazil's economic miracle, transforming raw materials into value-added products that competed on the world stage. But beneath the gleaming facades of their production facilities and the impressive financial statements that delighted investors, a corruption scheme of staggering proportions was quietly eating away at the company's foundations, setting the stage for what would become one of the most spectacular corporate scandals in Latin American history. The seeds of BRASKEM's downfall were planted deep within Brazil's political and business establishment, where the lines between public service and private enrichment had become dangerously blurred over decades of crony capitalism. At the heart of this system stood Odebrecht, the massive construction conglomerate that had grown from a regional contractor into one of the world's largest engineering firms through a carefully cultivated network of political relationships and strategic bribery. Marcelo Odebrecht, the company's charismatic chief executive and grandson of its founder, had transformed what was already a family business into a corruption machine of unprecedented sophistication, complete with a dedicated bribery department euphemistically called the Department of Structured Operations, that employed over 100 people whose sole job was to manage the flow of illegal payments to politicians and officials across Latin America. This department operated with the efficiency of a legitimate business unit, maintaining detailed spreadsheets tracking bribes paid, favors received, and political debts outstanding, while using a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts to launder the funds that would ultimately corrupt governments from Brazil to Peru. Odebrecht's tentacles reached deep into BRASKEM's corporate structure through majority ownership, effectively making the petrochemical giant a subsidiary of the construction empire, and ensuring that BRASKEM's executives would be drawn into the same web of corruption that had made Odebrecht so successful at winning lucrative government contracts. When Brazilian federal prosecutors launched Operation Carwash in March 2014, initially targeting a money laundering scheme operating out of a car wash and gas station in Brasilia, few could have predicted that their investigation would ultimately expose the largest corruption scandal in Latin American history and bring down some of the region's most powerful executives and politicians. The operation began modestly, with investigators following financial trails that led them to Paulo Roberto Costa, a former executive at Petrobras, Brazil's state-owned oil giant, who had been living far beyond his official salary through proceeds from kickback schemes involving the company's massive refinery contracts. Costa's cooperation with prosecutors opened a Pandora's box of corruption that extended far beyond Petrobras into virtually every major construction and engineering company in Brazil, including Odebrecht and its petrochemical subsidiary BRASKEM. As investigators peeled back layers of fraudulent transactions and shell company structures, they discovered that BRASKEM had paid approximately $250 million in bribes between 2006 and 2014, making it one of the largest corporate participants in the systematic corruption that had infected Brazil's political system. These bribes were not random acts of corporate misconduct, but rather part of a carefully orchestrated strategy to secure favorable regulatory treatment, tax benefits, and government financing that would give BRASKEM significant competitive advantages over rivals who played by the rules. The mechanics of BRASKEM's bribery scheme revealed a level of sophistication that would have impressed organized crime syndicates, involving layers of shell companies, offshore banking arrangements, and coded communications designed to obscure the true nature of the transactions from regulators and law enforcement. BRASKEM executives worked closely with Odebrecht's Structured Operations Department to identify key government officials whose decisions could impact the company's profitability, ranging from tax authorities who could provide favorable rulings on complex petrochemical transactions to environmental regulators who could expedite permits for new facilities or overlook violations at existing plants. The bribes were typically disguised as consulting fees paid to shell companies controlled by the target officials or their associates, with the funds flowing through a maze of offshore accounts in tax havens like Panama, Switzerland, and the British Virgin Islands, before ultimately reaching their intended recipients. One of the most significant beneficiaries of BRASKEM's largesse was Guido Mantega, Brazil's former finance minister, who allegedly received millions of dollars in exchange for ensuring that BRASKEM received favorable treatment from the Brazilian Development Bank, which provided subsidized loans that saved the company hundreds of millions of dollars in financing costs. The payments to Mantega were particularly sophisticated, involving a complex web of transactions that flowed through multiple jurisdictions and were designed to create plausible deniability for both the payer and recipient. The specific benefits that BRASKEM derived from its massive bribery investments were substantial and directly measurable in terms of enhanced profitability and competitive positioning within Brazil's heavily regulated petrochemical sector. Perhaps most significantly, the company secured over $4 billion in subsidized loans from the Brazilian Development Bank at interest rates substantially below market levels, savings that translated directly into enhanced profit margins and the ability to undercut competitors who lacked similar political connections. BRASKEM also benefited from favorable tax rulings that allowed the company to reduce its effective tax rate through aggressive transfer pricing arrangements and other strategies that might not have survived scrutiny from officials who had not been compromised through bribery. Environmental permits that might have taken years to obtain through normal regulatory channels were expedited, allowing BRASKEM to bring new production capacity online more quickly than would otherwise have been possible, and capture market share during periods of high demand for petrochemical products. The company's executives also used their corrupt relationships to gain advance intelligence about pending regulatory changes, giving them significant advantages in strategic planning and positioning relative to competitors who had to rely on public information. Additionally, BRASKEM secured preferential treatment in government procurement processes, winning contracts to supply plastic resins and other products to state-owned enterprises at prices above market rates, effectively allowing the company to extract additional profits from Brazilian taxpayers who ultimately funded these inflated contracts. As Operation Carwash investigators closed in on the Odebrecht empire, BRASKEM's executives found themselves caught in an increasingly desperate game of damage control, attempting to distance the petrochemical company from its parent, while simultaneously trying to destroy evidence and obstruct the investigation. Marcelo Odebrecht himself was arrested in June 2015, sending shockwaves through Brazil's business establishment and triggering a frantic effort within BRASKEM to contain the scandal before it could destroy the company entirely. Senior BRASKEM executives, including Chief Executive Carlos Fadigas and several members of the board of directors, had been directly involved in authorizing and overseeing the bribery payments, making it impossible to credibly claim that the corruption was limited to a few rogue employees acting without authorization. Internal communications seized by investigators revealed that BRASKEM's leadership was fully aware of the illegal nature of their activities, with executives using coded language to discuss bribes and taking elaborate precautions to avoid creating documentary evidence that could later be used against them in criminal proceedings. The company's legal team worked frantically to invoke attorney-client privilege and other legal protections to shield potentially incriminating documents from investigators, while simultaneously beginning discussions with prosecutors about a possible leniency agreement that might allow the company to survive the scandal intact. The international dimensions of BRASKEM's corruption became apparent as investigators traced bribery payments that extended far beyond Brazil's borders, ultimately implicating government officials in Peru, Venezuela, Colombia, and other Latin American countries where Odebrecht had significant business interests. The United States Department of Justice launched its own investigation under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, recognizing that BRASKEM's shares traded on American stock exchanges and that some of the bribery payments had flowed through the U.S. financial system, giving American prosecutors jurisdiction over the case. The Securities and Exchange Commission also opened an investigation into whether BRASKEM had violated disclosure requirements by failing to inform investors about the true nature of its business model and the legal risks associated with its systematic bribery activities. These parallel investigations created additional pressure on BRASKEM's executives, who now face the prospect of criminal charges not only in Brazil but potentially in the United States, where conviction could result in lengthy prison sentences in federal facilities far from their families and support networks. The international scope of the investigation also complicated BRASKEM's efforts to negotiate a settlement, as any agreement would need to satisfy prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions with potentially conflicting interests and legal requirements. The financial and reputational toll of the Carwash scandal on BRASKEM was devastating, with the company's market capitalization plummeting by more than 70% as investors fled amid uncertainty about potential fines, executive prosecutions, and the long-term viability of a business model built on systematic corruption. Credit rating agencies downgraded BRASKEM's debt to junk status, making it significantly more expensive for the company to refinance existing obligations and fund ongoing operations, while several major international customers terminated contracts amid concerns about doing business with the company under criminal investigation. The Brazilian government moved to exclude BRASKEM from eligibility for future development bank loans and government contracts, cutting off funding sources that had been crucial to the company's growth strategy and forcing executives to seek alternative financing in international capital markets at much higher interest rates. Employee morale collapsed as workers worried about job security and the company's future, leading to increased turnover among key technical personnel whose expertise was crucial to maintaining production quality and safety standards at BRASKEM's complex petrochemical facilities. The scandal also triggered a wave of civil lawsuits from shareholders, bondholders, and other stakeholders, seeking damages for losses attributable to the company's fraudulent activities, creating potential liabilities that could exceed several $billion and threaten BRASKEM's financial survival, even if it managed to avoid criminal prosecution. In December 2016, after months of negotiations with prosecutors in Brazil and the United States, BRASKEM agreed to pay a record-breaking fine of $3.5 billion to resolve criminal charges related to its participation in the Operation Carwash bribery scheme, the largest penalty ever imposed on a Latin American company for corruption-related offenses. The settlement required BRASKEM to admit guilt for paying bribes to government officials in exchange for business advantages, cooperate fully with ongoing investigations into other participants in the corruption scheme, and implement comprehensive compliance reforms designed to prevent future misconduct. As part of the agreement, several senior BRASKEM executives, including former Chief Executive Officer Carlos Fadigas, were banned from serving in leadership roles at publicly traded companies for specified periods, while the company was required to engage an independent monitor to oversee its compliance efforts for 3 years. The financial penalty was structured to be paid over multiple years. Recognizing that immediate payment of the full amount could have forced BRASKEM into bankruptcy and eliminated thousands of jobs in Brazil's already struggling economy. Despite the massive fine and admission of guilt, BRASKEM's agreement with prosecutors allowed the company to avoid criminal charges that could have resulted in debarment from government contracts and other sanctions that might have proven fatal to its business model, giving the petrochemical giant a chance to rebuild its operations on a more ethical foundation. The aftermath of BRASKEM's corruption scandal serves as a cautionary tale about the true costs of systematic bribery and the illusion that corruption provides sustainable competitive advantages in the modern global economy. While BRASKEM's executives believed they were securing their company's future through strategic investments in political relationships, their illegal activities ultimately threatened the very survival of one of Latin America's most important industrial enterprises and destroyed billions of dollars in shareholder value that took decades to build. The company's experience demonstrates how corruption creates systemic risks that extend far beyond the immediate costs of bribes themselves, generating legal, reputational, and operational vulnerabilities that can metastasize throughout an organization and ultimately prove far more expensive than any benefits derived from illegal activities. Today, BRASKEM continues to operate as a major petrochemical producer, but the company remains under enhanced regulatory scrutiny and faces ongoing challenges in rebuilding relationships with customers, investors, and other stakeholders who lost trust as a result of the Carwash revelations. The scandal has also contributed to broader reforms in Brazil's corporate governance standards and anti-corruption enforcement, as regulators and prosecutors have used the lessons learned from Operation Carwash to strengthen legal frameworks and investigative capabilities designed to prevent similar scandals in the future, ensuring that the massive costs imposed by BRASKEM's corruption will serve as a deterrent for other companies that might be tempted to pursue short-term advantages through illegal means.